Every so often it happens that the pace of events is so fast that I make a video discussing certain events, and then I find by the time the video is published that those events have already developed in ways that are either unexpected or which were consistent with some of my predictions. And the last program, the one I made yesterday, is a case in point. I said, for example, in connection with the struggle, the conflict within the Republican Party and the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell's strong support for providing weapons to Ukraine. I said that this must be causing growing irritation with McConnell, not just amongst Republicans in the House, but amongst Republicans in the Senate as well. And I wondered out loud whether that might eventually have an impact on his position as head of the Republican conference in the Senate. Well, I said that in the video, and then a short time later, the news came out that McConnell had come forward and said that he's stepping down in November. And that, of course, that news preceded the actual publication of the video itself. Well, there it is. There was another interesting fact about the breakdown of support for McConnell and criticism of McConnell within the Republican conference in the Senate, and that is that somewhere I saw a breakdown of the senators, the Republican senators, who voted with McConnell for the package, the appropriations package for Ukraine. And it was striking that he was getting support from the old guard. The younger a Republican senator tended to be, the more likely that senator was to vote against the appropriations package. So it looks as if there is a major shift underway within the Republican Party, and it is also a generational one. Anyway, I'm going to return to events in the United States briefly later in this program, but the other place where, of course, I was overtaken by events was on the battlefronts in Ukraine. For example, yesterday I discussed the fact that the Russian Ministry of Defense had not yet confirmed the capture of the village of Stepovoye, east of Berdichi, northwest of Avdiivka, even though virtually every report from the front lines confirms that this village has indeed been captured. Well, again, after I said that when I made the program, but before the program was actually published, just a few hours, in other words, later, which was just a few hours later, anyway, the news came that the Russian Ministry of Defense was indeed confirming that Stepovoye is under Russian control. And the statement that the Russian Defense Ministry published reads as follows: in a Avdiivka direction, units of the Center group of forces liberated Petrovskoye, took more advantageous lines, and repelled 11 counterattacks. Now, Petrovskoye is the Russian name for Stepovoye, and the Russians, therefore, have confirmed the capture of that particular village. But of course, it becomes much more dramatic because I was discussing yesterday Russian attempts to capture two other villages, Toninka and Orlovka. I spoke about how General Tarnavsky, the commander of the Tavria group of forces of the Ukrainian military, which is responsible for operations in the Avdiivka sector, had announced that the front had been stabilized along and that the Ukrainians were successfully resisting the Russians in Berdichi, Orlovka, and Tonenka. I said that with respect to Orlovka, that didn't seem to be true because all of the reports were suggesting that the Russians were in the process of capturing that village and were likely to capture half the village south of a stream, but that fighting still seemed to be underway in Tonenka. Well, just a few hours later, reports come in. The Russians apparently have now fully captured Orlovka, the whole of Orlovka, both south and north of this stream. They also appear to have captured Tonenka, and there are lots of reports circulating that they've also captured Berdichi as well. Stepovoye and Berdichi, an area where there was intense fighting between the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the one that is equipped with Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and previously the Leopard 2 tanks, and now the Abrams tanks, and the Russian army trying to capture these two villages, Stepovoye and Berdichi. I've discussed how, in my opinion, this is a pinning operation now, whilst the Russians actually launched their main assault on Avdiivka itself. Well, Avdiivka has now fallen, and the Russians have apparently moved on. It's confirmed that they have indeed captured Stepovoye, and it looks very likely that they've also captured Berdichi. Now, if all of these reports are true, and it's important to say that we still haven't had any confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry or any pictures yet of Russian soldiers raising flags in these captured villages or allegedly captured villages. But if these reports are true, if Orlovka, Tonenka, and Berdichi have indeed fallen, then that reinforces the impression that the Ukrainian defense system in the Avdiivka sector is chaotic and disintegrating and is in the process of falling apart. Now, I ought to say that my own guess is that the Russians have indeed captured these three villages, Tonenka, Berdichi, and Orlovka, but presumably we will get confirmation one way or the other within the next few hours, for all I know, before this video again is published. But we are looking also, it seems to me, at an absolutely chaotic situation. And there's a number of facts which independently point to this. The first is a comment from General Syrsky about the overall situation, in which, so far as I can see, he appears to be blaming the commanders, the actual local commanders, for the fact that things are going very, very badly wrong in Ukraine's defense lines. The report, his comments on the Facebook page of the Ukrainian General Staff, General Syrsky's comments, read like this: the situation in the area of the operation by the Ukrainian Defense Forces remains tense. That's something of a euphemism. A particularly tense situation has developed in the Avdiivka and Zaporozhye directions. Now, when he refers to the Zaporozhye direction, I presume he means that there's been bad news from Rabotino. I will come to that shortly. But then he goes on to say, during the operation, some commanders revealed miscalculations of their command of the situation and the enemy assessment, which directly affected the firmness of the defense in some directions. I have taken steps to remedy the situation on the spot with the allocation of extra ammunition and material and the deployment of required reserves. So he's sending more men to try to stem the situation, and he's burning up more ammunition, even though we're told that Ukraine is in short supply of that. But most important of all, Syrsky is blaming his subordinates. He's blaming the local commanders for the fact that in Zaporozhye and Avdiivka the situation is very bad. Now, there is one commander who is responsible for the situation both in Avdiivka and Zaporozhye, and that commander is, of course, General Tarnavsky. And I ought to say that I find it surprising, actually. I have been wondering for some time why General Tarnavsky is still in post, because he was the operational commander for Ukraine's disastrous counteroffensive, summer counteroffensive in the Zaporozhye region, the one that ended in comprehensive defeat last summer, which, I've discussed and others have discussed to exhaustion in many programs. He was the man, General Tarnavsky was, who claimed that the capture of Rabotino would open the way for the Ukrainians to accelerate their advance towards Tokmak and beyond Tokmak to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. And, of course, he was also the commander who was responsible for the defense of Avdiivka. And by any measure, this has been a catalogue of complete failure on his part. The offensive was a disaster. The defense of Avdiivka has been a disaster. It looks as if the situation in the Rabotino sector isn't going well either. So why is General Tarnavsky still in post? Well, maybe actually it isn't so much Tarnavsky's fault. I don't know what role General Tarnavsky has played in all of these misfortunes. It does seem, however, that he failed to establish strong defense lines west of Avdiivka in the event that Avdiivka fell. And we see from this report that he seems to be having serious trouble gaining control of the situation, rallying the troops as they're being pushed back by the Russians and creating stable defense lines. Well, that's General Tarnavsky, but of course General Syrsky is the man in overall charge, and I have to say it is never a good look to me when a chief blames his subordinates for when things go wrong. Surely the proper and correct thing to do, if General Syrsky has lost confidence in General Tarnavsky, is to sack him and appoint someone else, not to take to social media and publish implied criticisms of General Tarnavsky. It seems undignified to me and not what I would expect of a commander of an army at war. Anyway, that's just my view. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is the sort of thing that happens in armies, especially in the world time of social media. But I still have to say I find it extraordinary. I know of no single case, by the way, when General Gerasimov, the Russian commander, has published criticisms of his subordinates in this kind of way. Whenever he feels unhappy with how they're performing, which has been the case on a few occasions, he simply sacks them. Anyway, just saying. There is another piece of news which sort of confirms, or at least it does to me that things in the Avdiivka area, at least, are heating up, and that it is indeed likely that these three villages, Berdichi, Orlovka, and Toninka, have indeed been captured, and that the Russians are pushing on furiously further west. And that is that there has been a significant increase in the losses that the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians have been suffering. So yesterday, in the same Ministry of Defense bulletin, in which the Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed the capture of Stepovoye, they said that Ukrainian losses over the previous 24 hours in the Avdiivka area had been 165 troops killed and wounded, 4 tanks, 2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 1 US-made M113 armored personnel carrier, and 5 motor vehicles. Well, that was yesterday, but compare the losses that are reported in this area today. In the Avdiivka direction, up to Ukraine has lost 495 troops, 7 tanks, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 4 armored fighting vehicles, and 11 motor vehicles. So losses, reported losses, the claimed losses that the Russian Defense Ministry is talking about have more than doubled in this area. And note that there's also been an increase in tank losses. It was 4 that were reported yesterday, 7 that have been reported today. By the way, an enigma is that one of these tanks that has been destroyed in the Avdiivka area is presumably the Abrams tank, about which there's been so much commentary and discussion, and of which you can, if you look hard enough on the internet, find photographs and video films. But I noticed that the Russian Defense Ministry has never mentioned the fact that an Abrams has been destroyed, and I do wonder why. Anyway, a major jump in Ukrainian losses, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. So the Russians are pressing on. They're clearly advancing fast in the Avdiivka area. The Ukrainians continue to suffer extremely heavy losses. That is according to the Russians. And some of these losses suggest assaults on particular villages. But I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons why we've seen this upward spike in losses on the part of the Ukrainian troops in the Avdiivka area is that losses seem to increase when soldiers retreat from built-up areas into the open fields. When they retreat into the open fields, they're much more visible to the Russian drones, so that artillery, they can be subjected to artillery strikes and FPV drone strikes and other types of strikes. But also, of course, they are much more vulnerable in the open, when they're caught in the open, to heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force. And I understand that the bombing, the level and intensity of the bombing in this area remains extremely high. The Russian Air Force continues to be very, very active over the Avdiivka area. And by the way, just to say quickly, this is true right across the battle lines. The days, as I said from previous videos, when it was possible to say that Russia's Air Force was not participating fully in the conflict are now well gone. If you tot up the number of bombs, heavy bombs, that the Russians are dropping right across the battlefronts, it compares closely with the kind of bombing campaigns that we regularly see from the US Air Force in the various recent wars that it has been conducting. And there's apparently very, very heavy bombing of the Ukrainian troops in the Avdiivka area and in other places as well. Now, I mentioned that there'd been a major spike in Ukrainian losses in the Avdiivka area. The same is true in the Bakhmut area as well. And yesterday, for example, the Russian Defense Ministry said that in the Bakhmut area, where there's fighting going on well, they say Krasnoye, but it's Ivanivska, Bogdanovka, Klishevka, Kurdyumovka. Yesterday, Ukrainian losses amounted to 230 Ukrainian troops, 2 tanks, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, and 6 motor vehicles. Now, compare that with what we're seeing happen in the Bakhmut area as a result of the Defense Ministry report that has just come out this morning. It says that Ukrainian losses over the last 24 hours in the Bakhmut area, close to Andreevka, Klishevka, and Kurdyumovka, amount to 600 troops. Again, huge spike upwards, 2 tanks, 2 armoured personnel carriers, and 10 motor vehicles. Now, there is an interesting fact about this latest Defence Ministry bulletin, is that yesterday they were talking about fighting in Krasnoye, which is of course Ivanivska, and also mentioned Andreevka, Klishevka, and Kurdyumovka. But in their bulletin today, they are not referring to Ivanivska. They've not mentioned Krasnoye, which makes me wonder whether Ivanivska has either been captured or is in the process of being captured. There were lots of reports from Telegram channels, Russian reporting channels, and all sorts of places claiming that Ivanivska had been captured. Other reports saying that there was still intense fighting going on in Ivanivska itself. Perhaps that's correct, but if we follow the logic of what I said before, that Ukrainian losses jump when they are forced to fall back from a fortified position and can therefore be caught in the open. Well, we've seen another jump in losses in the Bakhmut area. Ivanivska is not being mentioned in the Russian Defense Ministry bulletins, latest bulletin. Could it be that what we're seeing is an exodus of Ukrainian troops from Ivanivska, and they've now been caught in the open, and that is the reason for the very high losses that are taking place there? Well, that's again my uninformed speculation, and yes, well, not uninformed. I mean, I am taking this from the Russian Defense Ministry reports, but there it is. It does seem as if something is going on. Now, I ought to say that both yesterday's Russian Defense Ministry bulletin and today's, in connection with the fighting in Avdiivka and in Bakhmut, repeats this formulaic phrase that the Russian units have improved the situation along the front line. And that, as I said, is a euphemism for the fact that the Russians are continuing to advance. So, bad news for the Ukrainians in Avdiivka, undoubtedly so, even though we don't yet have all the details, and it may be that once we get more information, we'll have to adjust our ideas a little. Bad news, it seems to me, in the Bakhmut area as well. And again, we don't have all the details. Complaints from General Syrsky about his commanders. He's clearly not happy with the way in which his commanders are running things. And more bad news for the Ukrainians from other front positions as well. And perhaps again, the most dramatic events are happening in the Marinka area. There are now lots of reports that the Russians are continuing to attack Krasnogorovka, and there's lots of film that they're heavily bombing Krasnogorovka, and there's video confirmation, apparently, of the Russians actually having entered Krasnogorovka itself. There's been many reports about this over the last couple of days. But yesterday, there was a report circulating on Ukrainian channels that the Russians have been driven out of Krasnogorovka. The streets and houses on the southern outskirts of Krasnogorovka that they have captured, that they had been driven back by the 3rd Assault Brigade. In other words, it looks as if the Azov Brigade has been withdrawn from the Avdiivka sector by someone, General Syrsky perhaps, and reassigned to try to hold positions in Krasnogorovka, which might, by the way, explain why Ukrainian defenses in the Avdiivka sector appear to be collapsing. Now, about the Ukrainian claim that they pushed back the Russians, I should say that this has been flatly contradicted by Russian claims. There's a railway line north of the positions which most reports have said that the Russians had captured in Krasnogorovka. But yesterday, at the very same time that we were getting reports that the 3rd Assault Brigade, the Azov Brigade, was pushing the Russians back, we got other reports, this time from the Russians, that on the contrary, the Russians were advancing deeper into Krasnogorovka and had successfully crossed the railway line. I should say that railway lines appear to be strong defensive positions. They're built on embankments. They're, of course, open. One has to pass open spaces. One has to climb up the embankment, making one very visible to defenders on the other side, and then climb down again. So it's understandable why railway lines are difficult places to cross. But Russian reports claim that the Russians have done it and that they're deeper inside Krasnogorovka itself. Well, I don't know what the truth is. We'll find out, no doubt, in the next few hours. But regardless, one way or the other, whether the Russians are advancing deeper into Krasnogorovka or whether the Azov people have indeed managed to push them back, it seems to me it's only a question of time now, again, before Krasnogorovka itself is captured. This place is being very, very heavily bombed. The Russians seem to be on the brink of storming a small village to the north of Krasnogorovka called Nevolskoy. I got the name correct. And the military summary channel correctly says, or so it seems to me, looking at a map, that if Nevolskoy is captured and with the Russians already pressing into Krasnogorovka from the south, then the Russians would be able to attack Krasnogorovka simultaneously from both the north and the south, and that the Ukrainian troops in Krasnogorovka could be taken into pincers. Now, I ought to say that both in the Avdiivka sector and in the Krasnogorovka Marinka sector, there are also lots of reports now of groups of Ukrainian soldiers who have been trapped and surrounded and in the fields. There's more reports of more surrenders. Well, we'll have to wait and see. Again, it's very difficult to get a complete sense of what is going on there. Anyway, lots of fighting going on in these places, in the Marinka and Avdiivka and Bakhmut areas. Fewer reports coming from other sectors, but to the extent that we are getting reports, they are very tantalizing. We see that Syrsky is complaining that the situation in the Zaporozhye sector is particularly bad. And perhaps that is connected with fighting in Rabotino. There have been lots of very conflicting claims and reports as to exactly what is going on in Rabotino. Some claims yesterday were saying that the Russians have actually captured Rabotino in its entirety. Others say that they control, for the moment, they still only control the southern and central parts of Rabotino. Other reports say that they've actually pulled back and that more of Rabotino is under control, under Ukrainian control. I will say straight away that I don't believe that Syrsky would have publicly complained about the situation in Zaporozhye if it really were the case that the Ukrainians were holding successfully in Rabotino. It seems more likely to me that the situation there is becoming critical as well. But there is another possibility, which is that a little further to the east of Rabotino, there's a rather large or largish town called Gulyapolye under Ukrainian control. The Russians have never at any point in time previously controlled it, but it seems that the Russians are advancing towards this town as well. Perhaps it's information about what is going on there that is causing Syrsky alarm. In the Liman area, where there were reports that some days ago that Makayevka village on the Oskol River had been captured, no confirmation of this yet from the Russian Defense Ministry. No confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry about the situation in Terny either, but it's likely that fighting is indeed taking place in that area, though again, we don't quite know what exactly is going on. The Russian Defense Ministry, in today's bulletin, has said that the Russian forces in this area, in the area of Kupiansk and Liman, have improved the tactical situation. In other words, another euphemism for the fact that they've advanced, and it refers to Sinkovka and Terny, which does suggest that fighting of some kind is taking place in these two. Well, in Sinkovka, we've known that this has been true for a long time, but Terny as well, it looks as if fighting is taking place there as well. Anyway, before I complete this summary of the news from the battlefronts, just one other quick thing, which is that yesterday an incident took place which was bizarre and extraordinary, and in its own way tragic. And we've had an account of what it was from the Russian Defense Ministry, though they don't actually tell us a huge amount about what happened, and it's expressed in very, very measured language, as one has come to expect from the Russian Defense Ministry. This is what it says. In Kherson direction, the Russian group of forces neutralized one Ukrainian sabotage group of the 73rd Marine Special Operation Center, which carried out an attempt to land close to the Tendra split using speedboats. As a result of a short battle, 4 of the speedboats with the landing groups were destroyed and sunk. The 5th turned round and travelled at high speed in the opposite direction. The enemy lost up to 25 Ukrainian troops, and I understand from other reports that these are actually, 20 of them were actually killed, 4 were wounded. 1 serviceman of the armed forces of Ukraine was taken prisoner, and he was wounded, and there are pictures of this. This is a bizarre incident at multiple levels. One of the things that made it most odd is that the Ukrainians all but announced this operation in advance. There were lots of reports that some big dramatic event was going to take place in this part of the battlefronts. That obviously alerted the Russians to something that would happen. So the Russians were ready. And when these 5 speedboats arrived, well, we see the disaster. And our old friend, Vladimir Saldo, has actually spoken about this. He has said that what the Ukrainians are doing makes absolutely no sense. He said it as follows. He said that any attempt by Ukrainian troops to reach the left bank of the Dnieper is doomed to failure and will entail extra casualties. I believe that the Zelensky regime, which is doing this on the orders from somewhere outside, not reckoning with people's lives, must be held responsible for these casualties. And Saldo is then reported by TASS as saying that Zelensky himself understands that Ukrainian troops will not be able to achieve any successes on the left bank. People are being sent to die in a bid to receive more resources and funding from abroad. And, well, I just don't understand the purpose of this stunt. One would have thought that the disaster in Kharkiv was bad enough, but somebody in Ukraine, or perhaps in the West, as Saldo is suggesting, thinks otherwise. Something was attempted here, and it failed completely. Well, there we go. This is the news from the Ukrainian battlefronts. Now, literally, as I am making this video, we are having reports pouring in from Vladimir Putin's State of the Nation address. And as he is speaking, as I am speaking, I'm not in a position to comment today on the many very interesting things that Putin is saying. But I did notice one thing. One thing did stand out for me, is that he appears to have confirmed the rumors that a Zircon hypersonic cruise missile was tested by the Russians in combat in the Ukrainian battlefronts. And I suspect this was a solitary Zircon missile. Apparently remnants of it were found. There were reports about this. The British Defence Ministry discussed it. The Ukrainians themselves also discussed it. If the Zircon is now going to be deployed in earnest on the Ukrainian battlefronts, in other words, it's going to join the Kinzhal in conducting further missile strikes on Ukraine, then it is going to be very, very bad news for Ukraine, and we'll have to wait and see what comes and arises out of that. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing I'm going to say about Putin's speech. As I said, he's speaking literally as I'm making this program, so I will have to discuss it in more detail, much more detail, tomorrow. Now, let's turn to other matters. The first is that I said yesterday that Kirill Budanov is clearly very angry with the Americans. He was contradicting their narrative about the death of Navalny, basically saying that the Russians are right and that he did die of natural causes. Budanov has also made other points. He's made other claims. He's also said that he's also ridiculed American claims that the Russians are using Iranian ballistic missiles in the battlefronts, and he's downplayed American claims that the Russians have used North Korean missiles as well. Now, I think he's probably right about that, but of course this is contrary to what the United States has been saying. They have been claiming that the Russians have bought large numbers of ballistic missiles from Iran and from North Korea. And here we see the chief of Ukrainian military intelligence saying that they're wrong. And I can't imagine that the Americans are happy about that. I said in my program yesterday that Budanov is clearly very angry with the publication of that article in the New York Times discussing the intelligence operations that the CIA and American intelligence conducted in Ukraine, and that he clearly feels that he's been left hanging out to dry. Well, since we're talking about special operations, covert operations, Denmark has now followed Sweden in closing its investigation into the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. There is still a German investigation underway, but Sweden and Denmark have shut theirs down, have closed theirs down. They are saying that this is clearly deliberate sabotage of these pipelines, but they've had to close the investigation down because they can't put together the evidence to bring a criminal case. This is a cover-up of the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines being carried out in full public view. The attack on the pipelines was an attack on one of the biggest, most important energy infrastructure projects in Europe. It was a devastating attack. Some people have described it as terrorism. President Putin has done so. It's often been defined as a criminal act. And yet we're told that the Swedes and the Danes are obliged to close down their investigations because they can't identify a suspect. Now, this in a part of the world where, as I remember, the Swedish police have been conducting an investigation into the murder of the former Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme, which basically seemed to go on forever. I have to say that I am completely unsurprised that these investigations are being closed down. But anybody who has any doubt that whoever it was who carried out those attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline is an ally of the West, or is the West, the United States, if you follow Seymour Hersh's articles and claims. Well, anybody who believes that, as I do, would not be surprised. And I have to say, the fact that there is, as I said, a cover-up being conducted in full sight all but confirms that. Notice the complete lack of response to this news in the media, the international media. They don't seem to be particularly bothered by the fact that the investigation into the destruction of Nord Stream 2 in Sweden and Denmark has, but not Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream, the Nord Stream pipelines has been closed down. I'm just saying. Anyway, that's one other curious piece of information. I would say that the Russians have been extremely contemptuous of President Macron's recent comments about sending EU troops to Ukraine. This comment by Sergei Fyodorov, a researcher at the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Europe, is typical. The French president is acting like a hawk, trying on Napoleon's full-dress uniform, which has been gathering dust in a museum for a long time already. This is a very dangerous game that most French people will not support. It deprives France of its role as a mediator in various crises, which is what it has always been proud of. And that, of course, is true. And as I said, the Russians have ridiculed this idea of Macron's. And I get the sense that there is genuine annoyance across the collective West with Macron for being premature in floating this idea and bringing it up in the way that he has done. Anyway, I want to turn now to an article that has been published by John Helmer at Dances with Bears. And yesterday I spoke about an article by Jack Rasmus, the American academic, who has written a brilliant overview of the war, explaining, bringing together all its various aspects, and going back quite a long way, and describing again the Clausewitzian style with which the Russians have conducted the special military operation up to this point. This article, by the way, by Rasmus can be found in various places. It's been published on various progressive magazines, and it is very, very well worth reading. But Helmer, at Dances with Bears, has written what I think is a very insightful discussion of where the war is actually going from this point on. Rasmus, if you like, is looking back, discussing the war as it evolved, discussing the various misconceptions which the West brought to Russian conduct of the war. Helmer is looking forward at what might happen. Now, as far as I know, John Helmer, who, by the way, I should disclose, I am acquainted with, we know each other quite well. Anyway, Helmer, as far as I know, is as much of a civilian as I am. But unlike me, he has had much time in contact with people within the Russian military. He has a very clear understanding of the way the Russians think about war, of the Russian command structure, of the Russian military ethos. And I have found him to be consistently one of the most insightful of the wider commentators about the way in which the war is going. And he makes some very interesting points in this article. He says first, his opening paragraph reads as follows: the collapse of the Ukrainian army following the Battle of Avdiivka and its disorganized retreat have accelerated Russian military thinking of how far westward the NATO allies will decide that the Ukrainian statelet can be defended against the expected Russian advance, and how fast new NATO defences can be created without the protection of ground-to-air missile batteries like Patriot, long-range artillery like the M777, mobile armour like the Abrams, Bradley and Caesar, all of them having already been defeated in the East. And he goes on to say, there is no longer a NATO command line of fortification east of the Polish border, which deters the Russian general staff. No bunker for the Zelensky government and its NATO advisors in which they can feel secure. And he makes the point, correctly, that all of us who've been trying to understand the battle, we are all reduced to guessing, but sometimes you can get a better sense of where things are going by going to the actual people who are running the war, who are the Russian military themselves. And of course, that is an extremely difficult thing to do because, of course, the Russian military tells us very, very little about anything. However, Helmer does have his sources. He's been the longest established serving journalist in Moscow. He's, as I said, been close to the Russian military at various times. And he can speak to people there. And he also knows very well how to read between the lines of Russian military publications. And he tells us that Moscow sources confirm the obvious. The operational objective is to apply more and more pressure at more and more points along the line in as many sectors or directions as possible simultaneously. And at the same time, air attack, missiles and drones are striking all rear and NATO airfield, road and rail nodes, ammunition storages, vehicle parks, drone manufactories, fuel dumps and other supply infrastructure, so as to make reinforcement and redeployment more difficult and perilous. And by the way, Shoigu has confirmed much of what Helmer is saying there about these Russian strikes. Shoigu calls them precision strikes on the infrastructure, the logistics infrastructure that Ukraine has been created and upon which Ukraine relies upon. And then Helmer goes on to say, what cannot be seen are the Russian concentrations of forces aimed in the north, centre and south of the battlefield. Instead, there is what one source calls an educated guess that when the main blow comes, it will be in the north. Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, Poltava, or alternatively, in the centre, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, or both simultaneously. So the source is not prepared to tell us very much, but he does give an indication of when that might be. And he says after the Russian election. And that, of course, happens on the 17th of March. And we're told that Putin intends to announce a reshuffle of his government. And this will happen within 4 to 6 weeks for announcement by early May. Ministerial appointments sensitive to the General Staff's planning are the Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, who's expected to remain in place, and the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who may retire. Now, by the way, there's been rumors that Lavrov has wanted to retire for some time. There were suggestions that Putin asked him to remain in post longer at the time when the special military operation was launched, and Lavrov agreed. But now that the situation is stable in terms of Russia's long-term relationships with its various allies and friends, it may be that the moment has come. For Lavrov to go to well-deserved retirement and for someone to take his place. And then the report, the comments of the source go on to say that the fortress and bunker plan for Ukraine is proving a failure, and that the Ukrainians are falling back on the old Wehrmacht tactic of ad hoc battle groups with increasing percentages of unit leftovers and low quality conscripts acting as fire brigades to plug holes in the lines so as to delay the Russian advances. And that it is too late, in effect, to create the big fortified lines that many have been talking about. They weren't created when they ought to have been, which was at the end of 2022, first part of 2023, after the successful Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region, and it's just too late to do them now. And the source was clearly someone with knowledge of the Russian military, and perhaps someone within the Russian military. Then says a few things about tactics. He says, I'm not sure, as some Russian military bloggers are, that the broad front approach Gerasimov is taking heralds a new approach to warfare or operational art. The push at different points, conserving men and material in favour of firepower, is being done as much or more out of political considerations, which include those of a domestic character, preserving public support and maintaining domestic stability. Also, the military objective since day one of the special military operation has been to draw in and destroy as many and as much of NATO's manpower and equipment in Ukraine as possible. And we have a very interesting comment about some of the earlier things that happened during the war. The Russian retreat conducted in the fall of 2022, that's to say the retreats from Kharkiv and Kherson, were part of the plan and were the Mongol tactic of attacking, making a big show of running away, only to turn to pursue and then destroy the enemy. The Ukrainians and their NATO handlers fell for it. Now they don't have the forces needed to maintain their fortress strategy, let alone conduct more in the way of counterattacks. It was in this fashion that Gerasimov gained the upper hand in the two-front war, the one on the Ukrainian battlefield and the one on the Russian home front. Deep battle, that is to say, conducting deep armored thrusts deep into enemy lines, is still Russian doctrine. Its form and components may change, but the concept remains the same. The art is in figuring out where and when the holes drilled in the other side's military, economic, and political structures will line up and present the path to be exploited. We can bet Gerasimov has known for some time, quite some time, where that will be. So that is an interesting take, that there will be an offensive, that it will be conducted very much on deep battle principles, a concentrated armored advance, and that, in fact, Gerasimov has been working to that objective pretty much since day one, and that he's played the Ukrainians, and by the way, the West, with considerable skill as he's been conducting the attrition strategy that leads up to this. And anyway, well, we'll see. We'll see where it all goes. But the take from Helmer's article is some kind of offensive in the spring after the election in Russia is out of the way, after there's been a reconstitution of the Russian government, and presumably after the spring Rasputitsa has passed and the ground is hard enough for sustained operations by armored forces. In the meantime, aggressive attrition continues and continues to smash up the Ukrainians right across the front lines. Now, there's also been a very interesting article, which Helmer has also republished, which is by a Russian military commentator whose name is Yevgeny Krutikov. Helmer has published him, has commented about his views before, and Krutikov has made the point that the Ukrainians have over-concentrated reserves in two directions. One is in Kupiansk, where they have been under the impression that the big blow was coming, and the other, of course, in the Avdiivka sector itself. And the result is that other fronts have been left exposed, and that it's quite possible that there could be a collapse in other places as well. And Krutikov mentioned specifically the area around Kurakovo, that's the town to the west of Krasnogorovka, which the Russians are currently attacking. And of course, he's also talking about potential attacks via Chasiv Yar once it's captured, towards Kramatorsk and places like this. And anyway, we will see again how that works. But the point is that the Ukrainian army is cobbling together reinforcements, reserves, by putting together units and to form fire brigade units, and is concentrating them along the front lines as it tries to hold back the Russian tide, and that it might not be able to do that for much longer. and the areas in which it is concentrating them, in the Kupiansk sector, around Avdiivka, they might not actually be the places where the big blow will fall. Anyway, all very interesting, and we shall see. Now, I'm going to return briefly to the United States. We've now had some further comments that the Pentagon has apparently found another $4 billion that it might use to provide further aid to Ukraine. Now, we've seen these accountancy exercises carried out before. The $4 billion supposedly is money that's been left over from the previous appropriation. The Pentagon supposedly has been unwilling to draw upon it until Congress votes a further appropriation. It's now looking increasingly unlikely that that will happen. So apparently the decision has been made that they will nonetheless use this money and use those $4 billion to supply more weapons to Ukraine. And as I understand it, the reason the Pentagon has been worried about using this money to send weapons to Ukraine is that without a further appropriation, there is no guarantee that the weapons that would be sent to Ukraine as a result of this use of this $4 billion would necessarily be replaced by new weapons which would be manufactured later. This is another pointless exercise. It's not because $4 billion can't buy a certain amount of equipment, but it can't buy the specific equipment that Ukraine most needs. It can't buy the shells, and it can't buy the air defense missiles. And the reason for that is that there are now critical shortages of both, not just in Europe, but in the United States also. If we talk about the situation with shells in the United States, if there was an abundance of shells in the United States to send to Ukraine, then it would have been very straightforward. The European Union, which has funding, or at least the member states do, Germany, France, they could have bought shells in the United States for Ukraine. The fact that they have never done so shows that there is not a huge inventory of shells left in the United States. What might happen is that the United States, however, might send some other weapon systems, perhaps specifically these ATACMS missiles that we've been hearing so much about, and that it could be that a decision will be made over the next couple of days or weeks to send these long-range ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, and the $4 billion would probably suffice to fund that. The ATACMS missiles are not going to change the situation on the battlefronts, but they will confirm further escalation. And they will also effectively confirm, or rather deepen the extent of the West's military presence in Ukraine itself. Now, as I've discussed in recent programs, a couple of days ago at the Elysee Palace, President Macron came up with the astonishing proposal that the European Union put together a force to send to Ukraine. And as I've discussed in recent programs, he's been ridiculed and criticized for doing that from every side. There are very critical articles about him, by the way, today in the British newspapers. But in a kind of a way, Macron saying this has smoked the fact that there are already NATO troops in Ukraine. It smoked it out. Because this led to an argument between a public row between Scholz, the German Chancellor, and Macron. The Germans are saying, well, instead of talking about sending soldiers, why doesn't Macron send weapons to Ukraine instead? Germany has supplied lots and lots of weapons. France hasn't, not to anything like the same extent. And it's clear that Macron is stung by that. But of course, that has reopened the question, or at least opened up discussion again, of the question of supplies of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. And Olaf Scholz blurted something out. He said that he opposes the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. And one of the reasons is that the Ukrainians themselves wouldn't be able to operate these missiles entirely by themselves. They would need assistance in doing so. The British and the Americans have people on the ground in Ukraine able to assist the Ukrainians to operate the missiles that the Ukrainians are purportedly launching at the Russians. The British and American supplied missiles, the Storm Shadows and the HIMARS and that sort of thing. But Germany is not in a position to do that. And of course, this blundering comment of Scholz has revealed the fact that there are British and American personnel in Ukraine helping the Ukrainians launch Storm Shadow and HIMARS missiles at Russia. So, in a sense, the NATO militaries, the American and British militaries, are in fact directly involved in the war already, very much as the Russians have been saying for quite a long time, actually. Now, of course, if the ATACMS missiles go to Ukraine, then that will lead to even more and deeper involvement by the Americans, because realistically, it's very difficult to imagine that the Ukrainians could operate missiles like the ATACMS entirely by themselves without assistance and support from the United States. Now, what makes this story of Olaf Scholz particularly interesting is that I have it from a source, a very reliable source indeed, that there are already Taurus missiles in Ukraine, that Scholz is actually talking from two sides of his mouth, as he often does, that the Taurus missiles were in fact delivered to Ukraine some months ago. They've been in storage there, waiting for use. The only question is how long it will be before Scholz and the German government are able to tick all the boxes and find some way around certain legal issues which are complicating their operation. So I should say that this source, who has provided me with this information, about whom I'm going to say absolutely nothing. Anyway, this source is someone that I consider entirely reliable. Now, I'm going to finish my program at this point. I've just given an overview of the military situation and some of the diplomatic things. It does seem to me as if we're looking not perhaps at a total collapse. There are Ukrainian forces still fighting and fighting bravely in many places, The operations chief of the Russian army, General Rudskoy, said as much a couple of days ago. But we are looking at a scene of gathering chaos, and there's a sense that it's starting to spread across the Ukrainian military, going beyond the specific events in Avdiivka themselves. One also gets the sense that Syrsky, the new commander, is unable to gain control of the situation and may be finding it difficult to get Ukrainian commanders to obey his orders. After all, he is openly criticizing them on Facebook, which, as I said at the start of the program, I consider an extraordinary thing to do. But there are other things going on. We've had information about the performance of the Russian economy in January, which suggests steady growth. I've had some very interesting discussions with various people about the legal issues relating to the frozen Russian assets, which might reveal certain facts about the difficulties in seizing these assets. And of course, the big news, which needs to be covered tomorrow, will be the details of Putin's address to the Russian Parliament, the State of the Union address, which is taking place today. And of course, things are happening in many other places. In the Middle East, fighting still goes on. The United States, bewildered that the Houthis have proved so much stronger than they imagined. And there are more proceedings against Israel in the ICJ. So many things to talk about. But this is where I finish today's program. I've discussed military issues rather more thoroughly than usual. But as I said, this is a major war taking place in Ukraine, and the military developments are now following each other very fast. So thank you again for joining me today for this program. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Let me remind you again that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Also by going to our shop, buying yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. Remember also that you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and Twitter X. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.